The Missing Hours. Episode 20. White Star had to answer for a ship it could not find. Cold open. On March 4th, 1893, a steamer called the Coventry was crossing the North Atlantic when her crew sighted something in the water. It was a lifeboat, capsized, empty, drifting. The following day they found a second one. This one was upright. On its side was a board bearing a name, Neronic. No ship, no bodies, no log, no signal had been received. No debris field had been reported anywhere along the route. The White Star cargo steamer Neronic had left Liverpool on the 11th of February, 1893. She was expected in New York in late February. She never arrived. The strongest physical trace reported with a direct link to her was not a wreck, not a body, not a log. It was two empty lifeboats drifting in a section of the Atlantic that gave back nothing else. Three things seemed to offer answers in the weeks that followed. Bottle notes reported by members of the public, the lifeboats cited by the Coventry, and a formal Board of Trade inquiry. None of them solved it. And White Star, which had named the route, the master, and the due date, eventually had to account not for a disaster it could describe, but for a silence it could not explain. This episode will not solve Neronic either. It will follow the last confirmed record, the public explanations the company gave while not knowing, the disputed notes that entered the case, and the question every institution in 1893 was trying to answer. When does a delay become a loss, and who has to say so first? A new cargo ship for a new Atlantic. To understand why Neronic's absence mattered the way it did, start with what she was. Neronic was the second vessel of the Bovic class, cargo and livestock steamers built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, the same yard that built the passenger ships the company is better remembered for. She was launched in May 1892. At the time of her entry into service, ships of her class were among the largest cargo vessels then operating on the North Atlantic. She was not a provisional investment. She was designed to move goods, cattle, and commercial freight across one of the world's most demanding trade routes, reliably, on schedule. She was not built for public attention. Unlike the liners, she carried no grand saloons and generated no first-class list. She had a small number of berths for cattlemen and the occasional working traveler, but her purpose was cargo, not comfort. That is exactly what makes her disappearance structurally strange. Neronic was new, large, and ordinary in the best sense, a ship that existed to complete crossings. The idea that she could simply cease to be traceable was, by the implicit logic of her own construction, not a realistic outcome. The Atlantic disagreed. 74 names. Neronic left Liverpool on the 11th of February, 1893, with 74 men aboard. They do not appear in the historical record the way passenger lists typically do. There are no published departure interviews, no first-class names in the press. But they existed in detail, and the record holds some of them. Captain William Roberts commanded the ship. He was from Crosby near Liverpool, a professional mariner whose appointment to Neronic placed him at the head of one of White Star's newer and larger cargo vessels. The record does not elaborate his biography the way it might for a liner commander. He was a working captain on a working ship. His name was attached to the departure. It became, eventually, attached to the absence. Among the officers, engineers, firemen, stewards, and cattlemen aboard were men from Liverpool, from Wales, from the network of British ports that fed the Atlantic trade. The crew list carries names and occupations, ranks in the deck and engine departments, men hired to tend the livestock, tradesmen like the ship's carpenter. These were working lives organized around the rhythm of a cargo crossing, a social world with a hierarchy, a pay structure, and homes waiting on the far side. The absence of passengers did not empty Neronic of human weight. It changed the shape of who was carrying it. A passenger ship loses its victims in public. A cargo ship loses them in the margin, where the names are harder to find and the stories are harder to follow. Departure. Liverpool, 11 February 1893. Noronic cleared port and entered the Irish Sea under Captain Roberts. The crossing was ordinary in its premise, a well-established Atlantic route on a ship built for exactly that purpose. Nothing in the available record marks the departure as unusual in plan or execution. White Star had been running ships on the North Atlantic for decades by this point. The route was known, the ship was new, the season was winter, which was understood to carry more weather risk than the summer months. But winter crossings were a routine commercial reality, not an exceptional gamble. Cargo schedules did not pause for winter. A note on what Noronic was carrying. The sources for this episode conflict on this point. One account suggests she sailed in ballast, without commercial cargo. Another references steel billets as part of her load. That conflict has not been resolved in the available record, and this episode will not lean on cargo composition as a factor in the analysis. The decisive fact of the departure is the departure itself. Noronic left Liverpool on the 11th of February, bound for New York, with 74 men aboard. That is the fixed point. What follows is not. Last route marker. 2 days after leaving Liverpool, Noronic passed Point Linus. Point Linus sits on the northeastern tip of Anglesey, on the north coast of Wales. It marks the edge of the Irish Sea and the beginning of the approach to open water, the last piece of navigable geography with a fixed name before a ship commits to the Atlantic. A vessel passing this point had passed the last reliable shore-based reference available on the British side of the crossing. Often a ship's pilot was put ashore here, a last human handoff between the port world and the open ocean. The date was February 13th, 1893. Conditions were heavy seas. That is the last clear route marker in the confirmed record. After Point Linus, Noronic moves from documented position into inference. She was on a known heading at a known general speed range, moving toward a crossing she had been built to complete. The navigation was not experimental, but the confirmed record ends here, at a headland in North Wales, in winter seas, on a February afternoon in 1893. It is easy to oversell this moment. Ships pass Point Linus every week. The crossing was standard. The significance of Point Linus is entirely retrospective. It is where the confirmed record stops, not where something visibly went wrong. After Point Linus, the Atlantic is wide enough to hold everything that came next. It gave back nothing that confirmed what that was. The due date becomes a problem. Atlantic crossings in the early 1890s took time. Cargo steamers were not racing the mailboats. A voyage from Liverpool to New York could run 7 to 12 days, depending on weather, sea state, mechanical condition, and the heading of the crossing. Winter passages, in particular, were understood to carry added uncertainty. Schedules for cargo ships carried more flex than published passenger sailing times. Noronic's expected arrival in New York fell somewhere in late February 1893. The exact date was not fixed to the hour, but an expected arrival window is not indefinite. Here is where the record provides a specific and useful comparison. The Bovic, Noronic's sister ship, the first of her class, departed Liverpool after Noronic and arrived in New York on March 2, 1893. By that point, Noronic was already overdue. Her sister had completed the crossing. Noronic had not. At some point, a shipping company and a port agent begin looking for a ship that has not appeared, and the question shifts. Is this a delay, or is this something else? The first public explanations centered on weather and mechanical disruption. Heavy seas had been reported in the North Atlantic that winter. A broken shaft, a damaged propeller, a forced reduction in speed, these were known risks, and each one could add days to a crossing. None of them, individually, signaled disaster. A ship late by days in winter weather was an inconvenience. A ship late by weeks, still unreported, still unsighted by any other vessel, was a different category of problem. White Star did not have radio contact with Naronic. It could not query the ship mid-ocean. It could only wait and watch and issue statements shaped by what it did not yet know. By the time waiting became watching, watching had already become searching. Could the delay be weather? Could she have put into a port unscheduled? Could a mechanical fault explain it? Each day without news made the answer harder to maintain. What White Star could say. White Star's public posture in the weeks following Naronic's expected arrival was, by the standards available to any company in 1893, defensible in its form, if not in its shelf life. The company did not have radio communication with its ships. Once a vessel left port, the only reliable confirmation of progress was arrival at the next port. A missed arrival was not automatically evidence of catastrophe. It was first a problem of information. And in 1893, information from the middle of the North Atlantic arrived slowly, if at all. What the company could say was this: the ship had departed in good condition, under an experienced master on a well-traveled route. Atlantic weather in February was known to be severe. Delays were recorded regularly. Ships sometimes put in at unscheduled ports. Mechanical faults could be managed at sea or require a change of course. What the company could not prove was any of this as applied specifically to Naronic. The Azores were checked. No news. Reports were gathered from other steamers crossing the same Atlantic that winter. None had cited Naronic in distress. None had reported collision with an unknown vessel. White Star asked, and the ocean did not answer. The public explanations were not fabrications. They were the available explanations, the ones that fit before absence had accumulated enough weeks to become something else entirely. But corporate communication tends toward the least alarming, plausible reading. A company speaking into uncertainty about its own asset will emphasize the explanations that keep the situation recoverable. By mid-March, after no news had reached the company, the press or the port from any source that could account for Naronic's location, the accumulated weight of that silence had largely extinguished practical hope. The transition from delay to loss was not a single announcement. It was something that happened week by week, confirmed by the absence of any other account. When does a delay become a loss? The answer, in Naronic's case, is when silence has lasted long enough that no other reading is available. The empty middle. There is a section of this case that no inquiry, no bottle note, no company statement, and no surviving record has been able to fill. It sits between Point Linus on the 13th of February and the first reports of Naronic's absence in late February. Roughly 2 to 3 weeks of crossing time, somewhere in the North Atlantic, in which a large and modern cargo steamer was operating until she was not. The missing hours in Naronic's story are not hours at all. They are a section of ocean wide enough to erase a modern ship from every confirmed record. This is the case's center of gravity. The departure is confirmed. The non-arrival is confirmed. What connects them has no evidentiary floor. And it has no floor in part because of the technology. Naronic had no wireless. She had no way to report her position once she was in open water, unless she was close enough to another vessel to signal. If something went wrong in the middle of the crossing, the first news of it could only come from what washed ashore, what another ship reported, or what was recovered. State what was recovered because the record has not been softened by subsequent discovery. No confirmed wreck of Naronic has been found. No bodies were recovered and identified as belonging to the ship or her crew. No final position was established. No log reached shore. No distress signal was recorded by any vessel or coastal station. Several other steamships crossed the same Atlantic that winter. None reported sighting Naronic in distress. None reported collision with an unknown vessel. What was found were the 2 lifeboats the Coventry reported on the 4th and 5th of March, 1893. One was capsized. The second bore the ship's name. They were not boarded or brought aboard. Their condition, beyond what was reported from a distance, is not recorded in detail in the available sources. 2 empty lifeboats and a name on a board. That is the physical record. It is the hardest turn the case offers, and it raises a question that nothing else in the evidence could answer. If the crew had time to reach the lifeboats, what happened to the people in them? After Point Linus, every theory is an attempt to fill the empty middle. None of them can be confirmed. That is the shape of the problem. The bottle notes. In the weeks after Neuronic's disappearance, multiple bottle notes entered the record. Several were reported, some from the Irish Channel, one reportedly from the Mersey, but 2 became central to press discussion and to the case's formal consideration. The bottles are evidence of what people claim to have found, not evidence of what happened aboard. That distinction is not pedantic. A bottle can be genuine as an object, found where reported, containing what was described, and still provide no reliable testimony about what occurred on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. A note can be written ashore by someone reading the disappearance coverage just as easily as it can be written at sea by a man in the final hours of a sinking. The physical evidence of a found bottle does not distinguish between those possibilities. The first note that received significant attention was found near Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, New York, in March 1893. It was signed by a man identifying himself as John L. Olson, describing himself as a cattleman aboard Neuronic. The note claimed that Neuronic had suffered a collision and was sinking. The name Olson has been compared to the crew list. It does not produce a certain match, but it does not produce the specific problem that the second note does. The second note was found at Ocean View, Virginia. It was signed by someone identifying themselves as L. Wenzel, and it claimed that Neuronic had struck an iceberg. The name L. Wenzel does not appear on the crew list. The name problem matters. A note signed by a man who does not appear on the crew list cannot be treated the same way as a verified log entry. The Ocean View note may reflect a rumor about the crossing, the press appetite for an iceberg story in the wake of the disappearance, or straightforward fabrication. What it does not provide is a confirmed account from a person who was aboard. If either bottle note is genuine, it would suggest that some members of the crew survived long enough to write and seal a message. But the record does not let us treat either of them as fact. They are part of the case's noise layer, material that entered the record, shaped the press narrative, and ultimately could not be verified against anything confirmed. The iceberg scenario was not implausible on its face. The North Atlantic in February 1893 carried seasonal ice. Other ships in the same period reported ice conditions. A collision with ice, at speed, in the dark, could account for rapid structural failure and a scattered debris field. But the Ocean View bottle does not confirm an iceberg strike. It confirms that someone wrote a note claiming one. Inquiry into absence. The Board of Trade conducted a formal inquiry into the disappearance of Neuronic. Understanding what it could examine is the same as understanding its limits. A maritime inquiry of this period could review the ship's construction and certification, her seaworthiness at departure, the qualifications and records of her officers and crew, the company's procedures, the planned route, the weather conditions known to have been present, any accounts from other vessels in the relevant area, and any material claims that had entered the record, including the bottle notes and the lifeboat sightings. What the Board of Trade inquiry could not do was reconstruct the final event. Without a wreck, it had no hull to examine for damage patterns. Without survivors, it had no testimony about conditions aboard. Without a recovered log, it had no internal account of what Neuronic's officers had observed or decided in the final hours. Without a confirmed final position, it could not say where on the route the ship had encountered whatever had ended the crossing. An inquiry is a machine designed for facts. The Neuronic inquiry was given, in place of facts, a record of absence. The inquiry could measure the silence, but it could not turn silence into a cause. The conclusion: that the cause of the loss could not be determined from the available evidence was not a failure of methodology. It was an accurate account of what the evidence supported. The Board of Trade said in effect, "We have examined what exists, and what exists does not answer the question." That is the honest outcome of an honest process applied to a record that was never sufficient to begin with. Was White Star buying time, or genuinely without answers? The inquiry could not determine that either. What it could do was confirm that the company's stated explanations, weather, mechanical delay, possible deviation, were plausible as general possibilities and unverifiable as applied to this specific ship. The inquiry drew the boundary between what could be assessed and what could not, and then it closed on that boundary. Theories that fit too much. 5 theories, 1 problem. Each explains the silence, but none explains enough. Severe winter storm. The North Atlantic in February 1893 was documented to be carrying heavy weather across multiple crossing windows. A storm severe enough to founder a ship of Noronha's tonnage could produce a scattered debris field that concentrates slowly, or not at all. It fits the absence. But there is no specific storm confirmed to have been in Noronha's path at the relevant time, and winter weather alone does not account for why no passing vessel reported anything. Iceberg. The season and region support ice as a genuine hazard. A collision at speed, in darkness, could produce rapid structural failure and a fast sinking. It fits the absence. And the lifeboat sighting suggests the ship was not lost instantly, which an iceberg strike at the right angle could still accommodate. The problem is that this theory rests partly on the Ocean View bottle note, and that note carries a name that does not appear on the crew list. Plausible as a general hazard, not confirmed as the cause. Collision with another vessel or a derelict. An abandoned hulk drifting at or below the waterline was a recognized North Atlantic hazard in this period. A large vessel striking one at night could sustain catastrophic flooding with minimal warning time. It fits the mechanics. The problem? No other vessel in the relevant period reported such a collision or any contact with Noronha. Boiler or machinery disaster. An explosion or catastrophic failure in the engine spaces could cause rapid structural damage and fire. It fits speed. But a machinery disaster of that severity would likely produce surface debris visible to other ships, and no such report exists for this crossing. Cargo shift or ballast issue. A sudden shift in cargo weight could cause a vessel to lose stability rapidly in rough conditions. The problem here is evidentiary before it is mechanical. The sources for this episode conflict on what Noronha was carrying. Without resolving that conflict, this theory cannot be assessed reliably, and this episode will not use an unresolved cargo question as an explanation. All 5 theories are consistent with the facts as we have them. That is not the same as saying all 5 are equally likely. It means the decisive evidence, the kind that would distinguish among them, is not in the record. The lifeboat sightings do add one constraint that the rest of the evidence does not. If the Coventry's account is accurate, and those were Noronha's boats, the loss may not have been so instantaneous that no crew action was possible. What happened after that, whether the boats were launched in time, whether they were occupied when they entered the water, whether they were swamped immediately, is not in the record. But the Coventry report places the boats in the record. That narrows the field slightly, and it does not help any of the 5 theories in particular. White Star's narrow corridor. Return to the company. White Star's position throughout the period between Noronha's expected arrival and the formal acknowledgement of loss was narrow in a specific way. On one side, the company could not confirm that the ship had sunk. It had no wreck, no survivors, no definitive report. On the other side, it could not produce the ship. It could not explain the silence. It could not account for 74 men. The corridor between those two facts is where the company's communication lived throughout late February and March of 1893. On March 15th, H.M. Kersey of the White Star Line acknowledged publicly that hope for Naronic had largely gone. It was not a formal declaration of loss. It was the kind of statement a company makes when silence has finally outlasted every available explanation. Careful in wording, constrained by the absence of a confirmed cause, but no longer able to sustain the language of delay. This is not an accusation. The record does not support the conclusion that White Star withheld specific facts from families or officials. The company did not have facts to withhold. What it had was a public posture. Delay, weather, possible mechanical trouble, maintained until that posture became untenable against the accumulating weight of weeks without news. The critique is subtler than concealment. Corporate communication can sound confident even when the record is empty. The language of reasonable delay is available to any company with a missing vessel, and it is available for longer than the public or the families waiting for news might expect. The mechanics of institutional reassurance do not require knowledge of the outcome. They require only the absence of confirmed contrary evidence. My read is that White Star's response is not evidence of what sank Naronic. It is evidence of how an ocean company manages silence. The transition from delay to loss, from absence to death, from waiting to record, happened not because new evidence arrived, but because absence had become extensive enough to constitute its own kind of fact. There was a point at which the company's explanations had exhausted their plausibility, and silence had become the only remaining account. That point arrived, in Naronic's case, without any new information. It arrived because enough time had passed. The people left outside the inquiry. The Board of Trade Inquiry examined the documentary record. The families of the 74 men aboard Naronic were outside the document. Captain Roberts had a home in Crosby. His name was in the press from the beginning. A named captain on a named ship gives the story a human center, even when the record is otherwise lean. The officers, engineers, firemen, stewards, and cattlemen aboard had pay expected, crossings planned, ordinary lives arranged around the rhythm of a cargo ship's service. None of them received a cause. They received in sequence no news, then delayed news, then reassurance, then the accumulation of weeks without news, then eventually the practical understanding that the ship was not going to arrive. The inquiry gave them a conclusion that was formally honest, cause undetermined, and practically hollow. A finding of undetermined cause does not tell a family what happened to the person they were waiting for. It confirms only that the institutions charged with knowing have examined what exists and run out of tools. The lifeboats make this harder, not easier. The Coventry account places 2 boats in the record, one capsized, one bearing the ship's name. That possibility that the end came close enough for the boats to enter the water, but not close enough for anyone in them to survive into the record, makes the absence of bodies and survivors not only a gap in the physical evidence, but a gap in the human one. Somewhere in the Atlantic, in February or March of 1893, there may have been a moment when survival seemed possible. The record does not document that moment. It only documents the empty boats. Ending, the open question. A ship between 2 named ports is supposed to be trackable by departure and arrival. That is the basic grammar of ocean transport. Leave one place, arrive at another. The company confirms both ends of the sentence. Naronic broke that grammar in February 1893, and the grammar has not been restored. White Star could name her route. It could name her master. It could name her due date and the sister ship that completed the same crossing and arrived safely. It could not name where the sentence ended or why. The Board of Trade could audit the silence. It could not fill it. The bottle notes could claim an ending. They could not prove one. The lifeboats could show that something had reached the surface. They could not say what. The open question is not only where Naronic went, it is how long a company, a newspaper, a family, and an inquiry can call silence a delay, before silence becomes the record? That answer, at least, the case does give us. In Noronha's story, it took a matter of weeks. The silence became the record when enough weeks had passed that no other reading was available, when the explanations had expired and the absence was all that remained. Noronha did not leave us a wreck to read. She left a route, 2 empty lifeboats, a handful of doubtful notes, and a company trying to decide when silence had become the story.